Prior to joining the ACLU, Mr. Drake served as law clerk for the Honorable James Ornstein in the Eastern District of New York and an Equal Justice Works Fellow at Human Rights First, where he authored the report, Crossing the Line, U.S. Border Agents Illegally Reject Asylum Seekers. Mr. Drake received his BA from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and his JD from the Georgetown University Law Center. Next, we have Linda Rivas. She is the Executive Director at Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center, where she serves the needs of asylum seekers and the immigrant and refugee community in El Paso, West Texas, and New Mexico. In 2016, Ms. Rivas also helped create the Borderland Immigration Council, a local group of attorney and advocacy groups formed to help address issues in the immigration system. Ms. Rivas was born in Mexico and raised in El Paso. She received her BA from the University of Texas at El Paso and her JD from Loyola College of Law in New Orleans. Then we have Fernando Garcia. Fernando is the founder and executive director of the Border Network for Human Rights, an organization that seeks to facilitate the education, the organizing, and the participation of marginalized border communities to defend and promote human and civil rights. As director, Fernando is responsible for facilitating the creation of human rights community-based committees and the training of human rights promoters in southern New Mexico, West Texas, Arizona, Houston, Dallas, San Jose, California, and New Jersey. Previously, Mr. Garcia served as the national coordinator of the National Movement for Legalization and Human Rights from 2001 to 2006. He studied political science and Mexican archaeology at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. We welcome all of our distinguished witnesses on this second panel and thank them for participating in today's hearing. Now, if you would please rise, I will begin by swearing you in. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record show the witness is answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and you may be seated. Please note that each of your written statements will be entered into the record in its entirety. I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes, and just as we did with the first panel, we will have an iPad right over here helping us keep track of time, and our staff will be timing you on that iPad, and we'll raise it up when you have 1 minute remaining. Mr. Shah, you may begin.
Your microphones. Try it.
Try it again? No.
Is it a red light?
The little red light is on.
Red light's on.
Oh,
there we
you
go.
Okay.
Thank you. Chair Escobar, Chairman Nadler, esteemed members of the subcommittee, thank you for the honor of appearing before you today, and thank you for coming to El Paso to hear firsthand the devastating realities playing out each day for so many along our border. I have the privilege of serving as attorney and policy counsel for the American Civil Liberties Union's Border Rights Center based here in El Paso, Texas. We at the Border Rights Center stand with border communities to defend and protect the United States constitutional guarantees of equality and justice for all, to live freely, safely, and with dignity. Border communities want border policies that respect the culture and people who have lived here for generations, as well as newcomers to the region. Since taking office, the Trump administration has attacked the border and immigrants from every angle, attempting to implement an array of policy changes under a clear goal: keep immigrants of color out of the United States, and do so at all costs, no matter the violation to constitutional rights or basic decency that follows. First, it is very important to make clear the civil rights challenges along our border neither begin nor end with Trump. President Trump inherited a deterrence and enforcement-only approach to border policy and found in Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, a rogue agency free from accountability measures and ready to carry out his anti-immigrant agenda. CBP's culture of cruelty has been on national display in recent months, but not because of the agency's own mechanisms for accountability or transparency. It took leaked screenshots to reveal the private Facebook group where agents posted racist and sexually violent content. It took text messages revealed in court for one Border Patrol agent's lawyer to argue his client's statement that migrants were, quote, disgusting subhuman shit, was commonplace and part of the agency's culture. It took our complaints at the ACLU to the Office of Inspector General and subsequent investigations to reveal CBP was holding migrants, including children, for prolonged periods in dangerously overcrowded and inhumane conditions. It took years of ACLU litigation to reveal 30,000 pages of documents detailing shocking violence and abuse by CBP agents against children dating back to 2009. Much of Trump's immigration administration's policy changes along the border have focused on limiting or obstructing the ability of migrants to seek asylum in the United States. Instead of people finding safety and refuge, thousands subjected to Trump's policies have been consequently kidnapped, extorted, raped, and even killed in Mexico. Not only are we ignoring our legal obligations, we are literally turning our backs on those seeking safety and refuge at our door. This administration has dramatically expanded the use of metering, the practice of turning away asylum seekers, and severely limiting the number allowed to enter the United States at ports of entry. In July 2018, CBP turned away the Castro family, including their 3 children, leading to a 6-month-long ordeal in Mexico where they experienced gang-related threats, extortion, and were later kidnapped. Only after ACLU and congressional intervention were they processed. There are currently over 26,000 such asylum seekers on metering lists waiting in northern Mexico. In addition, there is now 40,000 asylum seekers, including babies and children with disabilities, returned to Mexico under the Remain in Mexico policy, officially known as the Migration Protection Protocols. The region of Mexico to which migrants are being returned are among the most dangerous in the world, and documented cases reveal the devastating violence suffered after being returned under MPP. The U.S. government's border policies are not only impacting recently arrived populations, but everyday lives of those who call the border home. CBP claims exceptional authority within 100 miles of any international boundary, which encompasses 2/3 of the United States population. Agents, nevertheless, cannot pull anyone over without reasonable suspicion of an immigration violation or crime. Yet FOIA documents stemming from ACLU litigation reveal that Border Patrol is training its agents that facts such as, quote, whether the passenger appeared dirty can be used to justify a stop. Our country should be a place where everyone can travel freely to visit loved ones or seek medical assistance. The abuse of this administration cannot be fixed overnight, but if Congress is committed to addressing the underlying causes of Trump's violations at the border, it must shift immigration policy away from a deterrence-based, enforcement-only system to one that acknowledges humanitarian realities. U.S. immigration and border policies must be rooted in civil liberties and civil and human rights. This includes providing due process to those arriving in the country, safeguarding access to asylum protections, bringing transparency and accountability to CBP, the nation's largest law enforcement agency, ending border militarization that harms border residents and migrants, and not giving DHS one more dime or detention bed. Border communities, including El Paso, have borne the brunt of Trump's cruelty-first approach. Border residents are looking to Congress to provide critical oversight of DHS, cut funding to CBP and ICE, and pass legislation to undo and redress the damage done by this administration, while making structural changes to ensure this abuse never happens again. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Shah. Ms. Rivas.
Thank you, Chairwoman Escobar, Chairman Nadler. Thank you so much to this esteemed committee for traveling to El Paso, Texas. For the past 5 years, I have had the honor to serve at Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center. Las Americas is a local nonprofit organization dedicated to serving the needs of migrants, specializing in asylum seekers for the past 32 years. We are unwavering in our passion and in our mission, and this year, that conviction forced us to travel to Mexico in order to continue helping asylum seekers under the harmful Remain in Mexico policy. For years, we had worked to strengthen programs in our detention centers. We currently represent the same hunger strikers that Chairwoman Escobar described today. But our resources had to be diverted to Remain in Mexico. Less than a week after the ill-named Migrant Protection Protocol had been rolled out, Las Americas' phone started ringing off the hook. Our inclusion on a DOJ list, which I provided the committee today, was provided by DHS, and it was through this that they were able to call us Americas. In 23 weeks, we have been able to capture over 600 phone calls. Those are only the ones that we have been able to answer and register. 80% of the people who have called us report a fear of being in Mexico. We have been able to conduct with very little resources over 300 legal intakes across the border. We have successfully released 40 people from MPP based on vulnerabilities or fear to return in Mexico. And we have taken on 10 cases for full legal representation thus far. We have witnessed 9 pregnant women be subjected to be returned to Mexico, although they were over 7 months pregnant. We have witnessed 3 victims of rape, not raped by one, but raped by multiple men. We have also represented a woman who was they attempted to rape her in front of her 3-year-old child. That woman was sent back to Mexico, despite our best efforts. She decided to give up her asylum claim and go home. I have not heard from her since. One day, a man, U.S. citizen from Miami, came to our office frantic. He needed help for his sister, a 44-year-old deaf and nonverbal woman who had been returned to Mexico under MPP. How can we justify a deaf, nonverbal woman being returned to Mexico? Border Patrol confirmed to me that an interpreter was never secured for her. Within less than 48 hours, Las Americas sprung into action. We were in Mexico, and the next day we represented her in court. While we successfully removed her from the program, we still have to consider that her brother and his family thought that she was dead for several weeks because of the inability to communicate with her. I have now, unfortunately, had to meet not one, but 2 mothers who have been returned to Mexico with children with congenital heart issues. One mother, after being sent back more than once, was eventually let out. The other, that I just met the other day, has a son. When he is hyperactive, his lips turn purple. She was able to visit one doctor in Mexico, and the pastor from that same shelter paid for that medical care. They do not have a plan if the little boy were to lose consciousness. Just yesterday, I spoke to a client. Her case is on September 30th. We have been ready for trial now for several weeks. The day before trial, my client's house was raided for drugs. So her trial was continued to September 30th. But yesterday we spoke and she said, "Abogada, ya no puedo." Attorney, I just can't anymore. She's reached her end. She's reached her breaking point. This woman was returned to Mexico since April. She was kidnapped once for ransom. She was let go. She tried to live in a hotel. The hotel was almost robbed, with her living with other single mothers and young children. And she took a non-refoulement interview 3 times and did not pass. She's finally reached her wit's end. Her child was diagnosed with childhood anorexia, but the doctor says it could be something else, but there is not enough money for them to conduct more tests. It doesn't matter that I'm her attorney. It doesn't matter that we're ready to go to court. She's given up. She will be leaving on a bus Tuesday of next week. I will end with, remaining Mexico is not a representation of the beauty of this binational community. While hope does emerge from El Paso and Juarez, as it always does, the dangers that migrants face are so real that the shelter owners that help them ask migrants not to leave, not to talk in public, and to hide in order to remain safe. As we know, hiding is not acceptable under U.S. or international law. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Garcia.
Buenos días, Chairwoman Escobar, Chairman Nadler, and all members of the Subcommittee on Immigration and Citizenship, I thank you for coming down to El Paso. Today, I'm not representing myself, but more than 1,000 families that live in New Mexico in El Paso area. My testimony will touch on 3 points. The first, on the growth of the border and immigration enforcement apparatus. The second, on the impacts of social enforcement in our communities. And thirdly, a reflection on how to move forward with a good and better narrative for the future of America. During the last 30 years, since Operation Blockade in the early 1990s, our border from San Diego to Brownsville has become one of the most militarized borders in the world. Administrations of both parties have thrown our community under the bus for political gains. By 2018, CBP alone had a budget of $14 billion for border enforcement. Today, more than 23,000 Border Patrol agents are deployed between ports of entry and within our communities. We have more than 700 miles of fencing and walls, 12,000 underground sensors, 170 aircrafts and 8 drone systems in our skies, 84 water vessels, nearly 500 surveillance systems, 9,000 vision goggles, 6,000 thermal technology, dozens of immigration checkpoints and detention centers, dozens of National Guard elements, and active duty troops. All of this enforcement, of course, that has an impact in our community. As for the 2010 census, 14 million Americans live within 100 miles of the border. This is not an empty, barren place, but this is a thriving community full of life. Border Patrol checkpoints entrap people in our communities. One of our community leaders has a degenerative liver disease that can only be treated in San Antonio or Houston, but she cannot travel for surgery because she cannot pass the checkpoints. This region seems the only place in America where constitutional rights do not exist. Immigration enforcement agencies feel that they can do anything to our community with complete disregard of our rights. We see excessive use of force, sometimes lethal, against immigrant families and border residents. Agents enter properties and search homes without proper warrants. Agents use racism and racial profiling to stop, question, and detain people. Violations of the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment rights have become the norm. Additionally, an average of 500 migrants die every year looking for the American dream. Since 1993, more than 10,000 immigrants have perished in the deserts, mountains, and rivers of our border region. Today, border communities live in fear of the enforcement institutions that are supposed to protect them. We are subjected to a culture of abuse imposed by the harsh reality of detention, searches, and arrests without merit. The U.S. has built the largest domestic enforcement operations with a safeguards for effective accountability or oversight. This is not a question if we need enforcement at the border, but a question of what type of enforcement do we want. Making agencies to be accountable, respect our rights, know the Constitution, stop separating families, all of this is the right and the just thing to do and in keeping with our nation's values. Accountability to the community and transparency in their actions is not only a mandate, but a moral obligation. I commend Congresswoman Escobar for introducing H.R. 2203, the Homeland Security Improvement Act, which brings the necessary accountability measures to border enforcement institutions. These include an oversight commission made up of border residents that can investigate and evaluate enforcement strategies and practices, an ombudsman to oversee CBP, ICE, and USCIS, improvements in the complaint process, training rooted in civil, constitutional, and human rights. We know that American government works best with check and balances. I encourage you to review it and to support it. In our history, border has been defined by the characters of the nation, have defined the character of the nation, of our nations. It was the Statue of Liberty and the Ellis Island that represented the best ideas of America. This border here today is where the future of America will be shaped. We know that the U.S.-Mexico border can and must be the new Ellis Island of our era. The families arriving in El Paso today have the same hopes, aspirations, and dreams as those teeming masses at Ellis Island a century ago. Today, we must decide what kind of America we want, decide what our future will be. Will America incarcerate families, put children in jails, build walls, let immigration agencies act with impunity, or America would accept its destiny as a nation of immigrants that is exceptional because of its inclusivity, diversity, and commitment to each other? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very powerful testimony. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. I have been shocked in listening to this administration as they have denied the horrific conditions that migrants face in Mexico, and that they have championed MPP as some kind of victory in alleviating humanitarian concerns, when in fact, all that this country has done is take the misery that has arrived at our front door and shoved it into our neighbor's yard. Those of us here in this community, not only do we see the misery, but we can hear it. So without objection, I would like to enter the following articles into the record as evidence for the administration that people are suffering in danger. The first is, I'm in danger. Migrant parents face violence in Mexico under new Trump policy. The next is, Trump's Remain in Mexico policy exposes migrants to rape, kidnapping, and murder in dangerous border cities. And the third is, Central American migrants plead to seek asylum in U.S., not Mexico. To our attorneys on the panel, you have detailed examples of the dangers faced by migrants when they are MPP'd. But I think it's important for the American public to understand the challenges for due process and the challenges you face as legal advocates who have clients that have been sent to Mexico. So Mr. Drake and Ms. Rivas, if you wouldn't mind with the remaining 3 minutes and 30 seconds sharing that time to detail that for the American public.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I'll start by saying the ACLU, just days after the implementation of MPP, filed a class action nationwide lawsuit against the program in California because this program is blatantly and completely illegal. It is a program that is meant to cut off asylum seekers from their legal right to seek asylum in the United States. It denies them access to counsel, and it ignores a robust set of legislation passed by Congress for the handling of arriving asylum seekers at our border. That includes a process to ensure that we are meeting our international and domestic legal obligations to ensure that we are not returning people to situations of ongoing persecution. And what MPP does is precisely that. It returns people to ongoing persecution in Mexico and it exposes them to onward return to their home countries. So as a baseline matter, it is completely illegal. What we have seen through our plaintiffs and through our documentation of the program since its inception is, as those articles detail and as the Congresswoman has explained, every migrant returned to Mexico under MPP is subjected to a heightened risk of violence and abuse. There is not enough shelters to house them. The Mexican government cannot provide protection even if they tried. Migrants are a targeted group in Mexico for kidnapping and extortion. Groups that, I think it was just reported today, that groups such as Cubans are at even heightened risk of being targeted because they're perceived as having money. So what the Trump administration is doing is fueling organized crime's ability to take further advantage of this population.
And Ms. Rivas, could you tell us how hard is it for you as a lawyer to provide legal counsel to someone in another country?
It's incredibly difficult. We do not have office space in Mexico. We do not have the resources to acquire office space in Mexico. We are relying on unofficial relationships that we have with NGOs that happen to be in Mexico. One NGO, VIA, Derechos Humanos Integrales en Acción, was the first nonprofit to offer us a space. One day from walking from a governmental state office, the CAIM, Centro de Atención Integral al Migrante. It's essentially a center for migrant services. And I walked to VIA. After 30 minutes later, there was a shooting in the same path that me and my colleagues had walked as we were conducting intakes that day. This was prior to August 3rd. I will say that I was definitely not used to ever having to deal with gun violence in El Paso, Texas, and being there in Ciudad Juarez, it was very chilling as an attorney to have to deal with that. In addition to that, long wait times take me away from the office, takes me away from other clients, takes me away from court preparation, to have to wait in line. One time to have to be subjected to secondary inspection. This is a huge challenge for us. And the reason that I provided this called list of pro bono legal service providers that actually comes from the DOJ, from EOIR, is because this continuously is given to migrants that are placed in MPP by Border Patrol, by CPP, and by the judges. Sometimes repeatedly, the same list is given over and over. And the reason this is so important is because of these 4 people on the list for the non-detained court. We are the only nonprofit agency that is regularly traveling to Mexico to conduct legal intake and to help people that are in MPP. Others on this list are open to taking cases, but they're not actually traveling into Mexico. And I think that's just very, very important for us to realize.
Thank you so much. Before I move on, I will be entering without objection 3 additional articles, just as we try to deal with and face atrocities of one Trump administration policy. Another one is always right around the corner. The most recent one is the assault on the Flores settlement agreement. So I'd like to enter into the record, Trump faces long shot bid to jail migrant families indefinitely. 3 reasons why the new Flores rule does not pass legal muster, and immigration advocate weighs in on Trump administration's move to end Flores agreement. With that, I now recognize our chairman, the gentleman from New York, Representative Nadler.
Thank you very much. Mr. Drake, you spoke about the MPP program being illegal, and I think you've challenged it in court. What is the current legal status of that challenge?
So we won a nationwide injunction finding the program illegal. The Ninth Circuit has stayed that injunction, allowing the program to proceed while the Court of Appeals considers the merits of the injunction. 2 out of the 3 judges that reviewed the initial stay request by the government actually agreed with our legal arguments that the program is illegal. Nevertheless, they've allowed it to go forward at least until the next hearing in October, when the Court of Appeals will hear the merits of that injunction.
So that's nationwide?
Yes.
Okay. And the committee has been greatly concerned about CBP's attempts to restrict the number of people seeking asylum at ports of entry through metering. It obviously makes little sense to encourage people to seek asylum at ports of entry. Don't use illegal entry. Go to the ports of entry and then make them wait weeks or months to make their claim. The ACLU Border Rights Center sent a letter to the El Paso Port Director expressing concerns about port hardening, and the closure of ports of entry is a way to avoid its lawful duty to process asylum seekers, particularly Mexican nationals. According to your letter, CBP has even closed the entire port on some days, not just metered, but just closed them. My question is, has CBP responded, and what justifications has CBP provided for these operations?
The only public justification that CBP...
Have they responded to your letter?
They have not.
Okay, go ahead.
We hope they do.
And when was your letter sent?
Our letter was sent on Wednesday of this week.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Give them a few more days. So CBP, the only public justification CBP has provided for closing ports is the arrival of quote-unquote large groups of migrants. Information that we've received from at least one of those closures indicate that supposed large group of migrants was a group of 20 Mexican families, including children, asylum seekers, who are approaching the port of entry to assert their lawful right to seek asylum in the United States. More broadly, we have great concern around the port hardening. Any border barrier, razor wire, walls, all stand as a symbol of xenophobic rhetoric of this presidency. And the port hardening, as CBP calls it, is another example of that. It also spews fear in the community and can be seen as an effort to turn local populations against the arriving immigrants, because it creates a great deal of hardship for those who cross our border every day.
And what has been the impact in border communities of the border hardening of the metering?
We've seen extremely long wait lines to enter the country. Thousands of people cross these ports of entry in the El Paso sector every day to go to school and work and visit family members, and now face hour-long delays because CBP has restricted traffic down to one lane or closed the ports for many hours. The other concern is that every border crosser is crossing through what is clearly a militarized zone with razor wire, which perpetuates, again, this idea of fear and of an invasion that simply does not exist.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. Let me turn to you. Can you describe the change in numbers of Border Patrol personnel over the past 25 years in the El Paso area? And also, have you observed any change in the character of the way they behave?
Well, I think we had seen the numbers been triple in the last 23 years. And when we say that, is that every time when we had an immigration reform discussion in Congress, 2006, 2013, we didn't get immigration reform, but we get more enforcement. Every time we got more Border Patrol agents. The border, so at this point, as I mentioned, we had more than 23,000 of them. And the behavior, it depends on the region of the border. In El Paso, we had developed a good relationship with Border Patrol because we had engaged our communities and our institutions with Border Patrol and make them accountable. But that accountability is gone for the last 2 years. So the Trump administration has destroyed any good relationship
By doing what?
Community.
By doing what?
By curtailing the engagement with communities. We used to have regular meetings with Border Patrol. In the past, in the last 2 years, that is actually that hasn't happened. There is more incidents of abuses being reported in our community than before, to numbers that we didn't see for many, many, many years. So I think that is a major shift, especially in the last 2 years.
And I see my time has expired. Well, let me just ask one more. How the personnel additions, the additions in numbers, impacted the border communities?
Well, I think you have two different levels. One of them, it is that you see more Border Patrol members within our communities. They used to say that Border Patrol was only to protect the borderline, but that is not happening any longer. I mean, we see them within the 100 miles of the border, and that is impacting in a ways that we had seen this before. I mean, illegal entries into property, questioning children, high school children, students, in numbers that we had not seen before. So I think that is, and the numbers would matter, but would matter less if they would be trained and they would have some more accountability processes and mechanisms to be accountable to. And we don't have those at the border. There's no formal mechanisms to actually make Border Patrol responsible for their actions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
I
Chairman.
yield back.
I now recognize the gentlewoman from Washington, Representative Jayapal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all for your very, very powerful testimony, and more importantly, thank you for your work. You really are on the front lines. Yesterday, I observed the MPP court. I was there for about an hour and a half, and I had not observed an MPP court before. I've seen lots of other immigration courtrooms, and I think it is an absolute outrage that we call it a protection protocol, because there is no protection for the migrants that are there. And, the judges are trying to do the best they can, but about 250 to 300, I think, yesterday on the docket, Ms. Rivas, I saw them handing out these sheets. I looked at the sheets. I saw that there were 4 on there. Now I know that there's only one that actually travels into Mexico. Thank you for doing that. But I watched and listened over the course of an hour and a half as almost every single, I think there was one person in the hour and a half that we were there that we observed in 2 different courtrooms that had an attorney, that had representation. And there was the judge saying over and over again, I can give you a continuance, can you try to find an attorney? And each person was saying, I've tried, there are no attorneys, I've called, there's nobody here. And even at the points when they were asked, do you have a fear of returning to Mexico? Some of them raised their hands. Many of them said, at least one person said, very definitively, I don't even want my interview because nobody listens to me. Nobody is going to believe that I have a fear of returning. And so it is a terrible situation, not to mention we were told by the court officials that MPP has taken over the court proceedings. So they are now moving all the other cases that those courts should be considering to 2020, September of 2020. And each of these people that are coming in potentially getting a continuance, but then they have to stay here, they have to return to Mexico 3 months, they're coming back, women in the courtroom with babies, crying babies. And so I say all of that because I think it's important, this community knows, but hopefully we can get this information out beyond El Paso with this hearing. I wanted to ask Mr. Drake, because one of the arguments that's made that is absolutely false, and I want you to refute it for me if you will, I hope you can, I believe you can, is that this is the surge that's coming across that's required this, and there is no other way to deal with this. And so tell us, Mr. Drake, how we've had surges in the past, tell us the process that used to happen to process people in humane ways prior to MPP, because it is possible to do that. We don't need these policies, and I just would like you to tell us exactly what used to happen.
Sure, I'll start by saying that although there was a surge in recent months of numbers, we are still well below historic highs of border crossers. There was well over 1 million border crossers annually back in the early 2000s, at a time when the agency, I believe, had half the budget and 1/3 the personnel. And so with an agency that has more than doubled in size, is now faced with handling an even smaller population than they did in the past. What has shifted is the number of families entering, but the administration has known about that shift in numbers since 2013. And again, this is a group of people who are crossing the border seeking out U.S. agents. They are not single adults attempting to evade inspection. And in fact, many, as we've heard, want to go to ports of entry and actually present themselves. And so there is a broad set of immigration laws to process arriving asylum seekers, including IRA that was passed in 1997. There is massive due process problems with that law, but there are robust laws on the books that Congress passed with an understanding that these are an attempt at respecting our U.S. and international obligations to ensure that people aren't returned to danger. Immigration courts have famously been said to be death penalty cases tried in traffic court. Right. And I would say that MPP hearings, provide even a less degree of access to due process and to counsel than any other court in the nation, and certainly is not the way to handle the arriving population.
It's a bit of a sham, really, because you're in a courtroom, but you don't get representation, incredibly complex law. I wanted to enter, Madam Chair, into the record the Women's Refugee Commission report, actually filing of a complaint documenting 20 cases of MPP family separations. In many cases, parents were reunited with their children months later after obtaining legal counsel. I seek unanimous consent to enter that into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. And in my remaining 1 second, I wanted to ask Ms. Rivas, what is out of the 400, I think you said, calls that you've taken, did I get that number right? How many people can you actually represent given your staff and your resources?
The reality is very little. 10 is really pushing it at this point. Unfortunately, of those, some have decided to go back home. But just to kind of really paint the picture for you, our staff grew in response to family separation, and in response to horrific detention center conditions and prolonged detention. And when we have a partnership with the Southern Poverty Law Center that expands our capabilities to serve people in the detention center, we're thinking, we're finally, we're not going to be the scrappy nonprofit anymore. We're going to be built up. Then MPP hits. And then suddenly the attorneys that we were able to secure for the detention program, we can't do MPP. So I found myself having to go myself because I'm the director and I'm not under any specific grant. And so I said, okay, we're going to do this. And so the reality is no, very little. We don't have the resources for it. And we found ourselves as a community also saying, MPP has to come to an end, and we need to be calling for an end. So if we start expanding resources and writing grants, are we acquiescing to this program that this administration has thrust upon us? So we've been in an incredibly difficult position as a community, and the reality is that although we are one, and although we have registered 600 phone calls and we've conducted 300 intakes, we're not able to take many of those cases.
Thank you, Ms. Rivas, and thank you again to all of you for your work. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first, let me just say thank you to the lawyers. Often when people talk about lawyers, it's really not good things that they say about us. So speaking as a lawyer, and I know there's some lawyers at the table, and certainly there, let's hear it for the lawyers, everybody. They're doing a good job. And quite frankly, these days, on many of our issues, Mr. Drake, we count on you and the ACLU and a number of other legal rights advocacy groups to go to the federal courts to try to undo some of the damage that's being done. I know you've studied in Latin America. You know the situation in a lot of those countries. Regrettably, we have a president who just thinks that that's all fake news and that everything down there is hunky-dory and people are just coming here for a spring break. Tell us, if you had to just try to explain to someone, middle America across this country, on why people flee, 25 words or less, just get to the bottom line. Why are people coming to our country?
They're coming to our country because staying at home means a certain imminent threat to the lives of themselves or to their children, and not leaving is simply not an option.
It's not an option. It's life or death, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And Mr. Garcia, and by the way, Garcia is a great name. You have visited and talked to a lot of people who come for those very reasons, haven't you?
Yes.
And there's some people who actually think that detention centers are better positioned than what they were, what they're fleeing. Some commentators, conservative commentators on Fox News have even said, it's like summer camp. They get everything they need. They're being taken care of. What are you hearing here on the ground? Tell us a few stories to convince the American people that what we describe is not fake news. It is happening.
It is not true. Actually, we had interviewed several families, both in Juarez and in El Paso, about the conditions in detention centers, and we released a report about that. You have it in your, in my testimonial as an attachment. What we had documented is situations that we had never seen and experienced for many years at the border or in the interior. For example, the fact that one kid was asking for milk, and there were bottles of milk there in one of these Border Patrol stations. And one of the agents, they just throw the milk to the dirt without giving that milk to that child. That was extreme. We had another situation with, again, Border Patrol and ICE officers gather people in the courtyard of the detention center with a hose. They just water people because they were bathing them collectively. We never, with the clothes on, we never hear situations like that before. Or just throwing children and families in what is called hieleras, these extreme cold rooms where they get actually sick. When they are released, and they can also, our friends can present testimonies, many of them actually are released sick with colds and with other kind of diseases because the conditions that were there. So I think it is extreme. We never thought that we would see this in America. And they themselves, they are seeing that the conditions in those detention centers sometimes were even worse than the conditions in their own countries.
Right. Can I ask you just real quickly, do you think it's worse in for-profit detention centers versus nonprofit detention centers?
It is because, at least we think that there's a level of accountability for those detention centers run by the government.
Correct.
We need more than that. That's what I'm advocating
Yeah,
for that.
I agree
But
with you.
when you have private detention centers with no accountability, they don't have to report in many of these cases what are the conditions that they are living. We had also received letters from people within the detention centers, private detention centers, explaining the conditions about the quality of food, medication, water. It is extremely terrible.
Right. I visited both, quite a few on private and for-profit, nonprofit, and I think I agree with you. And the three of us, for you, are the immigrants being treated any better or worse in Mexico once they go back to Mexico or sent back to Mexico?
That's a great question. I have had the ability to tour the tents on the Mexican side of the border. And I have to say that I just found myself wondering, I'm just going to be very honest with you. 150 people are returned under MPP at a time, sometimes more. And what they've done with their tents is there's no sleeping space, there's just chairs. There's chairs, there's fans, there's fresh fruit, there's water, there's porta potties that frankly do not smell. You're in a pretty clean area under these tents on the Mexican side of the border. And I found myself wondering, how is it that the Mexican government is able to process so many people? They get processed, they get their Mexican, it's called an FMM, their Mexican visa. And I found myself wondering, how is it that they do this process in a way that's pretty efficient in comparison to us having people sleep under bridges as they did in March? Many of the people that I encountered in MPP at the very beginning, in April, the very beginning weeks of this, had described sleeping under that bridge. They described sleeping on rocks. They described having the children sleep on top of their bodies so that the children wouldn't have to sleep on rocks, gravel, dirt, construction material, is what they told me. What you see in Mexico is a ton of resilience. Shelter system, well, not a shelter system, unofficial shelters that are just trying to pull themselves together, do the best that they can. People starting to rent homes, people living in hotels. It's not okay. They're essentially doing the absolute best they can. But what I see, what I witness, is in many ways Mexico is doing the work that the United States should be doing, in a way that is as dignified as possible. It's far from perfect, but it's something that we frankly should be ashamed of, to not meet our international obligations.
Well, I think there's a lot of shame to spread around in on many of these cruel policies. So thank you for the work that you're doing, and to all of you. Yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I just would associate myself with the remarks of Representative Garcia in terms of thanking you all as a lawyer, the work that you all are doing each and every day and touching immeasurable lives here and across the state of Texas and really across the country. And so I thank you for that. One of the reasons why these field hearings are so incredibly productive, in my view, is we get to learn new things that I didn't necessarily know before, but also it underscores some of the necessity in terms of the legislation that we're considering that I believe we ought to move forward on. And, Mr. Garcia, you mentioned Representative Escobar's Homeland Security Improvement Act, which I couldn't agree with you more, and think we ought to proceed with a floor vote on that bill when we return from our work period. And with respect to your point about for-profit detention, I couldn't agree more. I believe we need to eliminate for-profit detention entirely. We have a facility in Colorado that is for-profit. And of course, the Dignity in Detention Act with our champion, Representative Jayapal's legislation that she's introduced, I believe we also should move forward, and the Congress ought to move on that piece of legislation. So I thank you and every witness for underscoring that. There are two facts in your testimony, Mr. Drake, that I thought bear mentioning. They were in your written testimony, and for me, they were very striking. The first is, quote, "At least 12 migrants have died in CBP custody in the last year, including multiple children. Notably, there had not been a single death of a child in over a decade." That is a damning statement, and it demands the attention of this committee and of this Congress, and that's why we're here. I am wondering, I know this is a bit outside of the work that you're currently engaged in terms of the litigation and with respect to the administration's recent MPP policy and so forth, but I had a chance to visit a number of facilities yesterday, including the facility at Clint. And at the time we visited, there were, I believe, 5 unaccompanied minors, unaccompanied children. And of course, this summer is the surge that you mentioned, tens of thousands of children being housed in this area and at that facility being detained. I guess the question I have, Mr. Drake, is where are those children now? I understand that they were released into ORR custody, supposedly, but I guess does the ACLU have a good sense of what happened and where we go from here?
I think it would be hard to say that we have a good sense of how anything within CBP operates. We obviously were not aware until the Flores Council visited Clint the degree of abusive conditions that were being perpetrated against children. And I think it brings it back to the central point of accountability and transparency within the agency. We simply do not know where children are being held, how many are being held, and for what period they're being held. CBP does not release that data publicly or to members of Congress. There's examples of, Clint is a strong example of that we did not know of the number of children being held there. We also, Congress, of course, didn't learn of the death of Jacqueline Call until many weeks later and until a news report broke that. And then it makes me think of the case of Carlos in the RGV who died on the floor of a Border Patrol station of flu symptoms and laid there on the floor with those symptoms for hours without any attention from an agent. And there has been no accountability for that death or any of the other 12 deaths in the past year, and certainly none for the death of children. And so, as you mentioned, legislation that Congress should be looking at and moving forward, the Dr. Ruiz bill around the care of children, and then there needs to be robust legislation. Representative Escobar's bill is a step in the right direction, but there needs to be vast changes to how CBP operates and provides information to the public and provides access to detention facilities. Otherwise, we may never know where children are held and under what conditions they're held in.
Last question thank you, Mr. Drake. For Mr. Garcia, as I mentioned, there are facts that we learn that we didn't necessarily know before. I come from Colorado, which is a state very deep into the interior of the country, and so don't know that I necessarily fully appreciated the context in which El Paso is located and the integration of this broad community across an international border. And as we were driving up, my good colleague Representative Escobar pointing out that Juarez is just a few miles from here, from where we sit. In your testimony, Mr. Drake, you mentioned that Border Patrol's interior enforcement operations encroach deep into and across the country because of the 100-mile zone, and that almost 2/3 of the U.S. population lives within that 100-mile zone when you consider the entire continental United States. So, Mr. Garcia, the question is, you talked a bit in both in your oral testimony as well as your written testimony about kind of the day-to-day impact. But I'm curious if you could expound a little bit more about the impact of the operations that have been implemented over the course of the last several years on just day-to-day life in this very vibrant, robust community of El Paso.
Yes, thank you. And let me just say that this is just a concern. The concern is that I hope that from the legislative standpoint, we don't only see the problems that Trump has created in the last 2 years, but we have seen many problems in the last 30 years. This is what I call the militarization of the border and the criminalization of immigrants. It's been happening for many, many, many years. And, we need to resolve MPP, metering, and other things, yes, but there's larger issues happening in our border community that were here long before Trump got elected. The only problem with Trump is that too many things start happening at the same time at the border, infused with racism and white supremacy. I think that is the new framework that we have. But I mentioned one of the aspects of this militarization is that you live in communities, and you can see in the communities that there's an extreme fear and uncertainty. When you have your children running away when they see Border Patrol vehicles, I mean, these are U.S. citizen children. U.S. citizen children running away from Border Patrol vehicles, that means that something is deeply wrong in this region. Secondly, I mean, people, our families, they had mixed legal status, as it was mentioned before. I mean, it's not that you have undocumented families in one community and the legal families or citizen families. We are all mixed. This is part of one community. And you have mothers afraid to go to take their kids to the school or to buy groceries or to the clinic because of this enforcement. And what it makes it even worse, it is the policy, it is the practice, but also the narrative that is being permeated in the border that this is a special zone, that constitutional rights do not apply, that law enforcement agents can do anything that they want. So I think that fear, that distortion, by the way, has penetrated within our communities in ways that we had not seen before. That's why we are saying policy change is important, but also we need to build a better narrative, a successful narrative that recognizes that impunity and abuse is not normal and that respect of the Constitution should apply to the border.
Thank you. And I now recognize Rep. Jackson Lee, the gentlewoman from Texas.
Thank the chairwoman very much. And let me just say that is the goodness of America, when good people, like each and every one of you, and those in this audience, and those who we see when we go and field hearings around the nation, are courageous enough and open enough and experienced enough to be able to tell us the truth to fix this long-standing broken process. I'm grateful for each and every one of you and the witnesses beforehand. Let me be very clear. It seems to get a little murky, and certainly I think the tone of the present administration, without disregarding, Mr. Garcia, your comments, but having been back and forth in front of the border and over across the border for decades plus in my service in public office, I'm going to testify and say that it was distinctive and different under President Obama. The reason I know that, because I did come to the border when many, many children, as you remember in 2014, were coming across the border. We opened up a number of settings. Those children came across, some came across with their parents or mothers, and they were allowed to stay together, and there was a difference. We were all trying to work to fix it, but there was a difference, and I think this is important to clarify. The other point to clarify is that immigrants don't have due process rights. Let me negate, deny, and rebut. That is not accurate. There are limits when it's a civil proceeding, but if you step on the soil of the United States, they should be respected for those rights. And thirdly, to Mr. Drake, thank you for giving me time when I came here, and you know I went across the border. The MPP is a blatantly illegal program, period. I can't imagine that the circuit is going to find any basis in law because the administration has no basis in law for the MPP program other than what is the figment of their imagination. It should be crushed, stopped, denied, ruled unconstitutional, and we need to write a law that forever bans a silly program like that. I want to ask you, and I'll have to do bionic questioning again very quickly, but let me just ask all three of you to answer this question of the militarization of the border. So Garcia, you articulately said it, but everyone can come at it. And this Posse Comitatus Act, the use of, and let me just say this, there are good men and women, Border Patrol, CBP, ICE. Reason is they're your neighbors. I see them. But what has happened is it's been flipped upside down as to what the role is, and it's horrible. So Posse Comitatus, great people in the Texas National Guard. They're at the border. Why? And so what has that impact been, and what is the public's understanding of U.S. military law and civilian law? Let me just, if you can take a note of that. Should we restructure these agencies so they get back to, I'm appalled that they're not meeting with you. And the FBI is doing the same thing. You can't get the FBI, unless you're a Republican, to come and visit with your constituents for informational purposes. And then the last one is, so you all can just take it as you want if you can remember, the conditions, I think you've already spoken about that, the conditions in Mexico. Just a point, if Mr. Drake, could you weave in, did anything ever happen in the death of Claudia Patricia Gomez, who was shot down at the border? Is there any relief to this kind of violence? Ms. Rivas, in your answer, if you can say anything about Sophia and the devastation of her example. I want to know whether we need to write specific laws adding to the great work that's being done, dealing with women and children, and then also, Mr. Garcia, we're going to write, working with my great chairwoman, to make sure that the private detention centers have the same responsibility reporting that the other centers do. But if you can answer those questions, please.
Sure.
Mr. Strake, why don't you just go ahead and just
Absolutely. So the military has no place on the U.S.-Mexico border. They are barred by law from conducting any law enforcement activity within the country, and they're getting dangerously close to doing that by being now stationed in detention facilities and at our ports of entry. Their presence adds to the overall false narrative of a crisis and threat of an invasion at our border, which is simply not true. Their presence is not needed, and they should not be here. The case of Claudia Patricia Gomez, the ACLU is representing her family in a civil rights lawsuit in which we're seeking $100 million in damages for her death. A Border Patrol agent shot her while she was hiding in a ravine in the head, and then lied to the American public about the circumstances surrounding that case until cell phone video came out that showed that she, in fact, had not attacked a Border Patrol agent and was, in fact, hiding in a ravine.
No criminal charges.
No criminal charges, and we do not know we do not know the identity of the agent that took that action. Regarding meetings or otherwise with Border Patrol, I think that the broad call is that there needs to, what we have seen is that CBP will not release any information or provide any information to local communities or the public or Congress unless they are absolutely required to do so by a court of law or by legislation. And so anything short of legislation requiring them to reveal basic information and data about their activities. They do not even collect data on stops that they conduct within the 100-mile zone, and they certainly, because they don't even collect it, don't report it, and so therefore there is no ability to conduct oversight of their racial profiling of border communities throughout the 100-mile zone. I'll leave the rest of the time for my colleagues.
That's all right. Thank you so very much. We're working on those issues. I hope you can work with us on that. Thank you.
Border militarization, I just have to say it. It means going into labor on November 30th and having a Border Patrol agent in the delivery area because he was there with a person he had apprehended. And as an immigration attorney, that was the most unpleasant experience. I contacted one of my colleagues at the ACLU. She said, there's nothing you could do, just write a blog about it one day. That is what militarization in this border means. Helicopters at night is me telling my kids that it's probably Border Patrol agents, and they know what that means. Should we restructure these agencies to meet with us? And in so many ways, yes, we need to restructure. And the meetings will happen sometimes not in the way that they used to, but there's no true access. There's no true answers that are being given at these meetings. And the reality is, for me, we need access to counsel every step of the way, from Border Patrol facilities to CBP holding under bridges to holding in bridges. We need access. When I walk a 19-year-old victim who was just raped and I'm told I cannot be with her as her counsel, that I need to leave immediately and I need to stand down, that is not correct. The fact that an MPP court, again, we're on this list, but yet we are not allowed to be even in the waiting room of that court. We are effectively shut out. We are told to wait downstairs. If we don't file an entry of appearance, we cannot speak to not one single person who is there for MPP court, not even to give basic information. We truly, truly need access as attorneys.
Mr. Chairman, if Madam Chair, if you would allow, I think the chairman is getting ready to answer the question. I don't have the time. I was going to yield, but I just want to say, those orders seem to be patently illegal. I don't know who has authority to keep you out of something that is called a court, a public court. Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Chairman,
did you want to say something?
would you were wondering, you were going to ask Ms.
I was just asking, who makes that
Yeah.
determination? Who makes the determination that you can't speak to people there, et cetera?
It's EIR headquarters that have made that determination. that
OIR?
Yeah, in Washington, yeah. Right.
Or
Essentially Immigration Court, the Executive Office of Immigration Review.
the court can't make that determination.
The court themselves cannot, and as a matter of fact, we don't exactly know what happened, but we have been told that we cannot speak to anybody who's in the MPP process, even in giving what we, again, many of us on this list came together and made a script that was just simply a know your rights for people who are in MPP. We are not allowed to do that anymore. I actually witnessed the only person that's giving information beforehand is the government attorney.
No basis in law. May Mr. Garcia finish his question? Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Garcia, and if we could wrap up, you have the final word.
Will do. The National Emergency Declaration of Trump is illegal and unconstitutional.
Sir.
And when I say that is because he went above you and about our communities
Yes.
to not only use military resources, but also deploy active duty soldiers in our community, violating the Posse Comitatus Act. And the precedent of that is that if we allow the militarization of the border, and we see it as a normal, then that will happen in Houston, in Chicago, in New York. So we don't want to go that route. And finally, to say that we've been working with Border Patrol for 20 years. We had very good moments of accountability. We had created a good engagement model. This is not about persons.
Right.
This is about systems. Systems that are broken, systems of oversight and accountability, and that is what we need to fix.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank you, Congresswoman Jackson Lee. This concludes today's hearing. I would like to once again thank both panels of excellent witnesses for participating in this very important hearing. I'd also like to thank El Paso. You all showed up. We have a packed house. I am so grateful to all of you for spending your morning with us and for showing my colleagues that we care very deeply about these issues and that we are going to help lead the way in reminding our country that we are a place of dignity and the people who arrive at our front door deserve equal treatment in terms of dignity. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witness or additional materials for the record. Without objection, and I, again, just thank you so much to my incredible colleagues. I'm so, so, so grateful. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.